Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends of the International Crisis Group, good morning and thank you all for being with us today. My name is Giuseppe Famaina. I'm the head of EU Affairs from our office in Brussels. I have the honor of welcoming you to this panel, which takes place at the same time as we launch our 2022 EU watch list. The watch list is a defining moment for us every year to assess the state of several hotspots around the globe and give advice on how the EU and its member states can play a positive role to help reduce civilian suffering and end deadly conflicts. This is our poll star, but for those who are not familiar with the watch list of Crisis Group, let me give you a brief reminder of who we are. Crisis Group is an independent organization working to prevent wars and shape policies that can build sustained peace. Our mandate is to engage all parties and support efforts to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent and deadly conflict. We do so by sounding the alarm bell, providing independent, field-based, and our high-quality analysis, and engaging directly with conflict actors and key international players to encourage informed and intelligent action for peace. This is why we gathered you for this discussion, and I'm grateful to all participants, especially those from the diplomatic and policy world, civil society, conflict and peace-building organizations that in these days of intense moments for European security could take the time to join us. We're really humbled by your participation. Indeed, this event takes place at a time of great tensions in Europe for the severe crisis that escalated around Ukraine's border with Russia and the ensuing confrontation with NATO. If unreversed, this escalation will lead to major consequences and change the face of European security for many years to come. And indeed, this will be one of the key issues that we will tackle today. Beyond this escalation, the challenges in other crises abroad and pressure that the European Union feels in its relations with major powers are among the reasons that pushed Brussels and European capitals to launch their security and defense integration and seek to sharpen the teeth of their trade and financial assets to leverage them for their foreign policy goals. Major projects that will make the EU busy this year, like the strategic compass and the so-called anti-coercion instrument, follow this very logic. Advancing in this direction can help shore up the EU's global role, especially given the combined economic and financial clout that the EU and its member states have, which also make of them a key development and humanitarian player. But as we observe in this year's watch list, in order to address the main conflict hotspots in the world, it would be important that while the EU moves steps forward to strengthen its capacities, it does not lose sight of the need to maintain conflict diplomacy front and center in its foreign policy. 2022 will be a record year for the number of people requiring humanitarian assistance. And while with the impact of COVID-19 still present, lacking basic services in many areas, climate change, all the new wars bringing more suffering in the world's most fragile states. The EU will be an essential actor to help face this enormous challenge, and with all of its resources combined, it can play a role to help overcome the conflicts and crises that we addressed in the 10 short briefings included in our watch list. And here are the crises we raised that you've seen in our introductory video. Colleagues across the organization tackled key priorities in Africa, looking at the Ethiopian crisis and the need to salvage the transition in Sudan. In Asia, we addressed the extremely dire situation in Afghanistan and the tensions over Kashmir. In Europe, beyond the Ukraine crisis, we warn of the risks of disintegration in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We addressed 3 crises across the Middle East and North Africa, the unsustainable status quo in Israel-Palestine, Lebanon's compounding crisis, and the hard path to restore constitutional order in Tunisia. And finally, in Latin America, we sounded the alarm on armed groups violence in Colombia, and we addressed the political deadlock in Venezuela. Let me note that all of this work is possible thanks to the support of the European Commission, and particularly their Service for Foreign Policy Instrument, which is an important partner for Crisis Group, and one of those with whom the very close collaboration, daily exchange, and the lively debates or arguments, I should say at times, that we have more probably with the Commission, the European External Action Service, and representatives from EU member states make it an important part to our work. We do share one important feature, which is the commitment to build a stronger culture of conflict prevention and early action. And to move one step in that direction, I will leave the floor to a fantastic panel, and let me say it, an all-women panel, to bring us at the heart of the questions that we raised today. And I'm very pleased to introduce you the moderator who will steer the conversation today. Welcome to Martina Stevis-Gridnev, the Brussels Bureau Chief for the New York Times. Martina joined the Times in 2019 after 5 years in East Africa for the Wall Street Journal, where she had also been the Europe correspondent between 2011 and 2014, covering the Eurozone and migration crisis. in Africa. She was posted to Nairobi covering geopolitics, migration, and economics, and among other things. In that period, Martina helped the world know more about state-building efforts in Somalia, the civil war in South Sudan, the refugee exodus from Eritrea, and crisis in Ethiopia and Sudan. Martina is a graduate of the University of Oxford with a master's in public policy, public administration and management from the London School of Economics. Born and raised in Athens, after having lived in East Africa, she now lives in Brussels with her family. And today we're under the same rainy sky. Good morning, Martina, and thank you very much for being with us.
Giuseppe, thank you so much. Good morning. Good morning, everyone joining us today. It's wonderful to see the faces of our guests and to see so many people joining us this morning. Sadly, we're not able to be together yet, but hopefully one day soon. As we try to talk through these issues, which are just so heavy on everyone's minds and so front and center in the global agenda today, the EU watch list by the Crisis Group is one of the foremost analyses of conflict and risk globally. And Giuseppe and I had been talking about what a rich and what a rich report it is, and how many different areas of the world are covered. Unfortunately, due to the escalating situation at the border of Ukraine, we will have to focus a little more on that today, as well as a couple of top other items in that report. Please do take the time to read the whole report and the depth and breadth of geography that it covers. But it does mean that today we will just be a little more focused on the very top items of that agenda, just to allow our guests as well and everyone who's joining us in the audience to reflect more deeply on what's clearly on everyone's mind here in Brussels and around the continent. Before I go on with the introductions of our esteemed guests this morning, as well as a little bit of agenda, just a couple of housekeeping issues I want to get out of the way, and I'll remind you hopefully throughout our time here together this morning. First of all, our event is being live streamed on the Crisis Group website. It is also being live streamed on YouTube. And we just really, I know it's early in the morning, but I really want to invite everyone to participate as much as possible. Your feedback, your questions are what can make this kind of slightly cold, remote event more full of life and more interesting. So please, if you want to share thoughts, comments, or questions, you can do so through the social media platforms. And you can also share these with your networks on social media platforms using the hashtag WatchlistTwenty22. Now, without further ado, I want to briefly introduce the two Crisis Group senior leaders who are with us this morning. Dr. Comfort Arrow, who will be going by Comfort this morning for everyone's ease and for a sense of being close together. Comfort is one of the world's foremost experts in West Africa affairs and Africa affairs more broadly. She is the president and chief executive officer of the Crisis Group, having risen to that position today through the nitty-gritty and the ground of expertise from West Africa to leading the Crisis Group's Africa project, spending also some time at the United Nations. It's really wonderful to see her. I've been following her for many years from my post in Africa, and also wonderful to see her rise to the top of the Crisis Group. And also want to welcome Dr. Olga Olenka. Olga, for the purposes of our forum this morning, Olga joins us because of the exceptionally pressing situation in Ukraine. She leads the Crisis Group project for Europe and Central Asia and is a foremost expert on Russia, Ukraine, and the broader region. She joins us this morning as we will focus part of our discussion on the situation in Ukraine. Before we get into that, however, I hope that we can take a few minutes to talk about broader trends we're seeing globally that are being addressed in this report and are also the context within which the conflicts discussed in the Crisis Group report are unfolding. Those do pose particular sort of risks to the European Union engagement in those conflicts, but not to sound like a total cliche, but also do present some opportunities. It's a very specific moment in international affairs, coming sort of halfway out of the coronavirus pandemic, but also at the back of the previous administration and the change of guard in the White House. And also against the backdrop of a very lively debate in Europe about Europe's role in the world, issues around strategic autonomy, and so on. Comfort, it would be really great to hear from you on what you guys see as the most sort of important global affairs trends against which these 2022 crises are unfolding.
Thank you very much, Martina, and it's really fantastic to be on the stage with you and to reconnect with you as well. And congratulations to you also on becoming the bureau chief for the New York Times in Europe as well. And it's good to rise through the ranks in our organizations, and I pay tribute to you as well. This is a pressing moment, as you say, Martina, and the fact that for the first time, the entire introduction of this year's watch list is dedicated to what we see as the most significant and worrying international crisis at the moment. I think this is the first time that we've used the introduction in this way, and it really strikes at the core of European security and the future of the European architecture as well, because that is being challenged. And I think this is precisely, as you say, thinking about the importance of Europe's strategic autonomy also is at the center of the entire watch list, but at the introduction as well. But as we said at Crisis Group, and it's very much reflected, Martina, in the other global watch list that we have, there are at least 3 or 4 trends that we see globally, and also which I think speak directly to Europe's security. Right through this year's watch list, the one big trend is about the human toll of the conflict, the humanitarian catastrophe that underpins a lot of the crisis we're looking at. Ukraine, which tops our lists. Afghanistan is another one. Ethiopia is right there. Also Venezuela, humanitarian emergencies there, and looking at Kashmir, Bosnia, another central security concern for Europe, that the fear of that peace that has been held for the last 25 years unraveling as well. So it's that humanitarian toll, the humanitarian suffering, the fallout from crises that really underlines much of our watch list, and also the global watch list. It will not be a surprise to all our listeners that the other undercurrent that underpins all the countries that we're focused on, all the themes that we're focused on, is that major power competition. And again, the West and Russia being at loggerheads over the question of Ukraine provides a perfect analysis or a hook in which to understand sort of the major power trends that we're seeing today. So whether it's Russia or the West, and also China and the US in another flashpoint, for example, over the South China Sea is another important trend to keep an eye on. Martina, you already pointed to another sort of trend, what I call the mega trend. As we're coming out of the pandemic, I think there are question marks about how each country comes out of the pandemic. The economic fallout, the political protest that we're seeing in a number of countries, whether it's Colombia that we mentioned in the watch list, or Lebanon also that we mentioned in the watch list, and Tunisia, and even Sudan. You could see the long tail of COVID has influenced and shaped much of the protest and the uprising and the political discord and polarization in a number of these countries. And the question is, to use the mantra of international leaders, how we build back better in a number of these societies, I think is a big question that even the European Union has to answer as well. And coupled with that, Martine, I think the other sort of mega trend that I would like to put a spotlight on, because the EU has also made it a center stage of its own strategy, is around climate change and climate security. And as you know, the baton of climate change will be handed over to an African country this year, Egypt. And certainly one of the major threats for the continent going forward is how it deals with climate security going forward as another overlay of the crises on the continent as well. I'll stop there just to give you a flavor of what I see are the undercurrents that bind all the countries together in our watch list this year.
Thanks, Comfort. It also feels like right now, and for some years, but this is really coming to the fore in this juncture, we are seeing a rehashing or a new type of competition for global power relevance. And, those of us who watched Africa for a while saw echoes of that. For example, in East Africa, where this report covers Ethiopia and Sudan, with sort of unlikely or surprising participants. In particular, I'm thinking about Gulf powers jockeying for power in East Africa. So even mega sort of resonating Cold War-esque power struggles that we're seeing playing out at Europe's backyard, but all the way to smaller, more regionalized types of power struggles seem to be playing out as a backdrop to these conflicts or potential conflicts. Could you just share some thoughts on this sort of fragment? I mean, again, not to sound like I'm speaking in slogans, but this fragmentation of the global international order and what feels like a reinvigorated interest in fighting for relevance. And let's face it, in a world where the United States seems particularly apprehensive about its role, its participation and its leadership in what's going on in Ukraine, notwithstanding. And where does that leave the European Union? And as an asterisk, a European Union that has struggled to present a common foreign policy front and is increasingly better able to act seemingly through its so-called development or international partnerships branch, and using its leverage as a major development and humanitarian actor rather than a foreign policy actor in conflicts right in its neighborhood.
Thanks, Martine. That's quite a big question, and I'll try to sort of take each one at a go. So, I mean, you spoke directly to one of the big issues that I've always paid attention to on the continent, and we talk about the global major power competition, but what has been really striking is Africa diplomacy and intra-Africa diplomacy. So the relations between neighboring states on the continent, but also the wider regional continent as well. And I've always tended to say, pay attention to the competition between neighboring countries on the continent. For a very long time, we tended to assume, or we tended to look at Paris, London, and Washington as the arbiters, the supervisors of these conflicts that happened on the continent as well. But increasingly in the last 10 years and the last 20 years, increasingly Africa's own fate, the resolution or seeking resolution to a lot of the conflicts on the continent are often determined in Addis, in Kigali, in Kigami, in Abuja, in Pretoria, because these countries themselves are powerhouses. These countries themselves are the superpowers, if you wish, of the continent as well, and they are both they're both players in the crisis, and they're also the ones that we need to look for solutions as well. So it's not surprising that we of Crisis Group, we took a huge leap in making that decision that we were going to invest in regional structures, in regional diplomacy, in the Africa Union, in the West Africa regional body, ECOWAS, in the Southern Africa body, SADC, because we felt that they were key architectures, multilateral bodies in their own right, that were going to shape and determine a number of these conflicts as well. But what we've also noticed on top of that, Martina, and you pointed to it, is a fragmentation in the international order as well, and recognizing that we now see multiple players trying to determine and shape a number of the conflicts on the continent. And those multiple players, you know them very well because you spoke about them, particularly in the Horn of Africa, the entrance of Turkey, the entrance of the Gulf countries into the Horn of Africa region, the way in which their notions, their perceptions of stability influenced and shaped the outcome of those conflicts as well. So if you listen to the Gulf countries, they will tell you that they seek stability in the Horn, particularly in Sudan and Ethiopia. The question is whether their understanding of stability matches with the Horn's understanding of or what we see as a desirable outcome for stability in the region as well. And then you talk about the US. I think one of the most distinguished features today of international relations is that there is less US power compared to what we saw 20 years ago. So the US of 20 years ago doesn't have the same significant leverage that it had 20 years ago. There's a clear shift of power, a decline in US influence, some uncertainty that is accompanying that decline of US influence. We also should need to understand that as the US appears to be declining or waning in its influence as well, there are other players who have come into the picture as well who are asserting their own influence. And it's there, I think, that we are in this watch list particularly, and you said it yourself, trying to urge and make sure that the European Union also is clear and articulate in terms of its own strategic autonomy and striking its own independence and making sure that the EU is able to articulate a very clear line in its own security architecture. The EU, as you know, Martina, is still an influential player, for example, in the Horn of Africa and on the continent writ large as well. And it has a number of roles that it can play in the continent, and we can discuss that further in the Q&A.
Speaking of the Q&A, please don't wait until the very end of our smaller format discussion to post your questions. Please keep sending those questions through the platforms on which you're following this event. And remember to share your thoughts and questions and reflections on social media using the hashtag WatchlistTwo2022. Comfort, thanks. And I do realize that was a bit of a broad question there. I want to take a beat to acknowledge that just a few short months ago, the fall of Kabul to the Taliban and the hasty and chaotic departure of the US forces reverberated around the world, created a very live situation for European Union countries, and also created some optics as well as some substantive shifts in that global power structure that I think are going to be playing out in other parts of the world, other potential conflicts, as well as to the global sort of mind and nuisance and psyche on how they view America, an issue that you touched upon just now. Can we talk a little bit more about what the crisis group feels the European Union should be doing in Afghanistan, what it can be doing meaningfully as a country falls into an absolutely devastating humanitarian disaster at the back of that American departure?
Thanks, Martin. And I mean, and that's a really sort of good sort of question to think about the EU's role. I think one of the challenges for the EU and for the West also is recognizing that the decision of cutting off aid in Afghanistan is very much at the center of why we have a massive humanitarian catastrophe looming today in Afghanistan as well. I mean, we can and we do say in the watch list that there's a level of blame that could be placed at the door of the Taliban to explain why we have this humanitarian crisis, and including the fact that the Taliban government itself refusal to acknowledge the scale of that humanitarian disaster as well. But the humanitarian fallout and the problems that the country has today is largely to be laid at the door of international community as well. And to answer precisely your question, one of the things that we say in the watch list and even the global 10 conflicts to watch is that we need Western powers to balance the needs of the Afghan population for a reasonable functioning state and the importance of engaging the Taliban on the respect for rights and especially of women and minorities, while also developing a realistic working relationship with the authorities in Afghanistan as well. We also, I think one of the points that we make, and it's a difficult pill to swallow, given the international perception of the Taliban, I think one of the steps that the EU needs to think about is taking more targeted support for state structures that directly support livelihoods and Afghans' well-being. Now, there is a concern about having to work with the Taliban, meaning therefore giving recognition to the Taliban, but we can't ignore the fact that a number of Taliban's Afghanistans are suffering today as a result of the economic fallout of the country. The economy is in free fall at the moment. We have a drought, we have a famine. As I said, the humanitarian fallout is quite significant, and we have to find a way in which to deal with and work with the Taliban to help reverse the current trend in the country. The policies of the EU and also of Western donors have not kept pace with the fast-growing humanitarian crisis that is now affecting Afghanistan as well. So one of the steps that the EU could take is to ensure that there is targeted sanctions as opposed to sanctions that therefore impact the entire country as well. The EU, for example, Martina, is wanting to ensure that the Taliban focus on issues around good governance, around inclusion of women, around education. And the EU has taken a very firm line on a number of governance issues. Engagement along these lines would give Western powers a firmer line, but at the same time, you've got to also find a strategy that doesn't further isolate the Taliban, further distance the Taliban away from you to the extent that you can't then support the return of essential services into Afghanistan as well. So we have to strike a balance, one that allows the EU to address what it's concerned about, which is the looming humanitarian crisis in the country, and targeted support, very careful targeted support, I think, would allow for improving the situation in the country.
Thanks, Conrad. Just a last question for me, and forgive me if this is a bit left of field, but it's something I personally look at a lot in my work. Mm-hmm. And we touched upon it earlier when we talked about the role of the European Union in all of these conflicts or potential crises, in particular the ones that are closer to home, so North Africa, Middle East, as well as Africa, and obviously the ones that are on the European or Eurasia kind of precipice. One of the things that I've observed have been tacitly forming EU policy increasingly has been the management of what the Commission would call migratory movements. the concern of the political implications for domestic and Europe-wide politics of the arrival of more displaced people fleeing these conflicts, or the economic ramifications of protracted crises in their home countries. So much of political discourse on the continent over the last 5 years has been shaped by the Syrian war and what it created, and we would be remiss not to note that both in the case of the crisis in Afghanistan, as well as what's going on in the Horn of Africa, these are traditional regions from where refugees have been, or asylum seekers have been, reaching Europe. And now we're seeing more representation from the Sahel, West Africa, as well as other parts of the Middle East. It feels to me like the concern about fresh arrivals of asylum seekers is quite central to how the European Union is thinking about its foreign policy. I want to ask you quite straight up whether you think that's a good thing, and whether that's something that we need to acknowledge in the EU, or whether in fact it's something that potentially presents a handicap for the EU's influence in these places, that actors are aware that the EU is very concerned about refugees and asylum seekers, and that lessens the EU's ability to act as an honest broker in these conflicts. I'd love your thoughts on that before we start talking a bit more about Ukraine.
That's a good and controversial question to end with. You know, the mobility, migration, security, it's very clear to us that they're all roped into sort of one language, one thread, and that is in a sense has shaped the EU's own perceptions and reactions to a number of crises for the last decade or so. Martina, we saw it play out in the Horn. You worked for a very long time on the question of the exodus from Eritrea, and also we saw it play out negatively in Libya and in the Sahel as well. And we have, as you quite rightly noted, Martina, we have seen political leaders use it as a leverage over the EU to gain certain things from them. Certainly, the security veto, or getting more security sector assistance, whether it's in the Sahel or in the Horn of Africa as well. So we've seen the double-edged sword of the question of migration and mobility. There's two things, Martina. One, it's very clear to me, and we saw it play out across the Sahel. You can't outsource your security and hope that countries that struggle to maintain their own security on the border, countries that have a very porous security border, you can't expect them then to also handle the question of migration on your behalf. Secondly, you can't assume that various militia forces themselves can be instrumentalized to also act as security border forces on your behalf as well. And because militia forces know this, because political leaders know this also, they're able to use that as leverage vis-a-vis the European Union also. You will also, Martina, be very familiar yourself of the very tense and awkward conversation between the European Union and the African Union. One was talking about mobility, economic mobility, i.e. the African Union, and the other one was talking about migration northwards, which is the European Union. I think one of the things that was missed in this conversation was recognition that a lot of those who are displaced in a number of these countries, a number of the refugees are actually moving around on the African continent, for example, as opposed to coming up to Europe as well. And this is a fact that is often missed. There's a narrative that is painted by some populist leaders in Europe to assume that there's this flood of migrants coming up to Europe seeking a better life, when in fact a number of those displaced, or a number of those seeking refuge, are actually going into neighboring countries. And a number of neighboring countries have been at the front line of the refugee question. We've said it also already that if Europe wants to deal with migration also, or the fallout of migration also, it needs to be more serious itself about crisis management and conflict prevention. And let me be clear also about early action as well. We see a number of these crises as they unfold, Martina, and oftentimes our leaders act too late, and then they start chasing the crisis, and then we get into this inevitable controversy around migration and assuming that you can pour or militarize the response to these crises as a way in which to stem the flood of migration as well. And surely Europe has learned the lesson from that in the last 5 years, as we've seen in the Sahel. Not enough of security or militarization of the solution is going to help you resolve this question around migration as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Comfort, and thanks for going into that depth on that question and indulging me. I'd love to move to a sharper discussion on Ukraine specifically now with Olga. I think the best way to start is just let Olga share some thoughts on the latest in the situation, as well as the reflections from her team and the crisis group report on the rapidly developing issues in Ukraine and what they mean for the European Union. And hopefully we'll have time for some debate as well. Please do send us your questions, and thanks for staying with us.
Thank you so much, Martina, and thank you, Comfort. I thought the conversation the two of you just had was really very insightful and valuable. As I think everybody knows, we've had, over the last few months, we've seen a very substantial buildup of forces near Ukraine's borders, in Russia, and more recently also in Belarus, as Belarus and Russia say they're preparing for exercises. What has followed has been a flurry of diplomatic activity between Western countries and Russia, which isn't 100% about Ukraine. And what that reflects is the fact that Ukraine is a nested crisis, a nested challenge within a broader crisis and challenge of European security, and very different views of what it means to make Europe secure, primarily from the perspective of Moscow and that of Brussels and Washington. So the conversations that we're having on the one hand about Ukraine are the old conversations about Ukraine that have been in place since the start of the war in 2014, when Moscow first annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine and then supported and sent in its own forces into eastern Ukraine to begin a war that has continued to this date. And then on the broader European question, it is Russia's belief, its perception that there has been a steady and gradual encroachment on the part of the allies of the United States in the form of NATO and the European Union, looking to come closer and closer to Moscow's borders and to threaten Russia's security, Russia's sphere of influence, as Russia feels it should be, and potentially even Russia's right to govern itself and make its choices and be, the country it wishes to be. Of course, Western states say that this was never what was going on, but you have this perception, and especially since 2014, the start of the war in Ukraine, it has been exacerbated. It has manifested in more and more military activity, exercises, buildups, which make everybody nervous, which do result in dangerous incidents. So what Russia is asking of Western states is commitments to no NATO enlargement. It is commitments to a return to effectively the balance of forces prior to 1997. It's asking that any forces currently in place on the territory of states that joined after that date be pulled away. The return of US nuclear weapons to the United States, so no US nuclear weapons in Europe, and a ban on intermediate range missiles in Europe, which it would also abide by. what the Western states have been offering is conversations about limits on exercises and indeed deployments. And, in a lot of ways trying to address some of the root causes, but not a commitment to never, ever, ever enlarge NATO, especially to Ukraine and Georgia. This isn't because they plan to invite Ukraine or Georgia to join, it's because they don't want to foreclose the option for the future. And we're going to have to see what happens, right, going forward. I think the Russians have responded to the Western response to their initial draft treaties that they proposed with their demands by saying that, interesting, but not good, at least not good enough, cause for conversation. They've also made it very clear that they want to be talking to the United States, not to NATO, not to the European Union. And this is interesting because the European Union actually plays a huge role here. Right, it was an EU association agreement that started the Maidan in Ukraine that set the ball rolling back in 2013 and 2014. It is the European Union that is going to impose the most important sanctions if Russia does take additional military action in Ukraine, and Western states are, forced to respond to that. So, the European Union plays a very crucial role in how this goes forward, and yet faces this tremendous challenge of dealing with a Russia that wants to talk to Washington about all of these things. Kind of this denial, not just of Ukraine's agency, but the agency of all of the countries of Europe except Russia, effectively. And that's at present, there's very good transatlantic unity. Not everybody wants to do the exact same things, but there is agreement on the general goals and principles. But it does put European states and the EU in a very challenging position.
On that note, and if you'll indulge me, just one question, and then we'll take questions from the audience for the rest of our session. So please do keep those questions coming. Just on exactly what you said, Olga, with regards to this tough spot the EU finds itself in on Ukraine, which is unfortunately also a very familiar spot in which it finds itself in many crises in its neighborhood where its interests are directly at stake. This morning when I woke up, I read a story by my colleagues in the New York Times about the efforts the Biden administration has made to really actively include a broader collection of EU allies and the European Union institutions themselves in discussions on Ukraine, making them privy to Washington's thinking and so on. But as you note, Russia wants to talk with Washington, not with the European Union. And that does create a sort of weird dynamic for the EU. To what extent, I want to ask, and this year, 2022, is that of the European Union's making? We heard sort of quite awkwardly and embarrassingly the voicing of German confusion, at the very least, on thoughts on this situation. For example, when the EU doesn't present itself as a singular thing with one voice in the major conflicts that are brewing in its neighborhood, why would the participants in those conflicts or potential conflicts want to talk to the EU over Washington, which is half the world away? If it seems to me that this is something that needs to be answered in Brussels quite urgently with regards to Ukraine, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that can happen convincingly right now.
So I would point out that the Russians don't want to talk to NATO either, right? So it's not simply that the EU hasn't been forceful enough, hasn't been unified enough, hasn't been decisive enough. It is that Moscow approaches this from the rather odd position, right? That on the one hand, it would like less of American engagement in Europe, and on the other hand, that the United States is the only party it wants to talk to about Europe. Right, it's one does kind of want to say, well, could you pick one of these? I do, however, think that the European Union faces this tremendous challenge of being, on the one hand, an actor on the global stage, and on the other hand, a collection of actors on the global stage, each with their own interests, their own goals, and their own strengths. And that is inherently a challenge to manage for an institution of that sort. It has to make some decisions, right, about at what point can it be Brussels, can it be the European Union choosing things that other people, that then the member states have to fall in line for, and at what point can it not? And I think to a large extent, it was tried to avoid making these decisions because they're very difficult and they're awkward and not everybody's going to be happy. And the problem is that you maintain unity by not making a decision, right? You keep everybody in line by not actually forcing the hard choices. And if all you've accomplished is unity, but your unity can't get you anywhere, it's not much of a unity. So I think if the European Union is to be an international actor, it will have to reckon with these things. Can it do this in the moment? Honestly, in the moment on the Ukraine crisis, it's going to have to just continue consulting, working with NATO, right, where there's a lot of overlap, but certainly not complete overlap, working with Washington, working with the Canadians, also allies, because this is a very complicated engagement. And over time, yes, developing coherent positions of its own that truly do represent the member states, and that create real incentives for Moscow and for other partners to, in fact, work with the European Union and not try to split it all up and talk to everybody in turn, or talk to the Americans and expect the Americans to deliver the entire West.
Thanks, Olga. I'm just going to immediately jump into questions from our audience. I want to give that as much time as possible. Please keep those questions coming. I think we'll have time for 2 or 3 before we switch to our breakaway sessions. Here's the first one, and I think it's one for Comfort, related to what Comfort Arrow said. First, about the role of regional organization action, which the European Union also supports. What, for instance, could the African Union do in Northern Africa, notably the Libyan crisis related to migrants, but also peace and stabilization with the withdrawal of foreign fighters and mercenaries? And there's a follow-up, more specific question regarding the role of the EU in Africa. You said that the EU still has a role, but the Africans increasingly want to choose their cooperation partners. And for example, developments in the Sahel. How can the European Union ensure that it remains the interlocutor and preferred partner between conditionality and cooperation? This is a big question, but a very important question. I recall a European Union senior diplomat in the Horn telling me that he wants the EU to not just be an ATM. So I think that's what this question hints to. Comfort?
Yeah, the person who asked this question is a little bit more diplomatic, but that was certainly the center of the report that we did a few years ago on the relationship between the EU and the AU, and the EU's concern was that it was increasingly being used as an ATM. It's now a very popular phrase that we hear between that very awkward relationship between the two most important multilateral entities today on the continent. And I think it's because of that, because of the recognition of the EU's weight on the continent, that we continue to see this question coming up. And Martina, you all know as well as I do, given your time on the continent, that it's a jealously guarded relationship. And the EU oftentimes, the officials oftentimes feel that they don't get the recognition that they want from the AU or AU member states, given the size of their contribution. But I also think it goes back to your earlier question, Martina, about the realities of geopolitics on the continent, the change of the international relations also vis-a-vis the continent, that today the continent has multiple choices. It no longer depends on Brussels or, as I said, Paris or London or Washington to decide its fate. It gets to choose, and sometimes it looks eastwards, towards China, for example. I mean, increasingly, the Gulf states, as you and I have both recognized, have become important political and economic players. Let's not ignore that fact. And the EU has had to. The EU is also increasingly forced to rethink, therefore, its relevance, its strategic relationship with the continent. And so, while I would certainly say it's still an important partner, whether it's the preferred partner, I think it's also down to some of the realities and the choices that the continent has today. On the specific question about the AU and Libya, let me now make a plug that next week, and another one of the annual watch lists that we put out every year is one specifically dedicated to the Africa Union. And what we see is that sort of the priorities that the union must focus on. And the person who asked this question, I should say that we do have a specific section in that AU watch list that's coming out about how the African Union can develop a strategy for the return, for example, of foreign fighters from Libya. This is a very contentious issue on the between, for Libya going forward in the midst of its very sort of slowly advancing peace process. And here I think the EU has an opportunity to play a role. For example, the AU is trying to carve out a space for itself in facilitating the removal, for example, Martina, of Chadian and Sudanese fighters operating in Libya. And Libyan parties and outside sort of powers agree that Libya's future stability is also contingent on the departure of these fighters. And I think there is a possibility and an entry point here for the EU to help the AU think about how to begin to manage the withdrawal of those foreign fighters, so that they don't, and in managing that, when we take them back to their countries of origin, that they then don't become a destabilizing force when they go back to their countries. I no doubt don't need to tell your listeners about what happened also last year in Chad as well. So that's another key issue. But clearly we need a clear strategy for relocating the fighters, and also maybe tied to that, focusing on disarmament and reintegration. And I think the African Union is going to certainly need the support of the EU and other partners to think about that. And I mean, I can add more to that, but I see that we are short of time, and it'll be good to also get some other questions. But the whole issue about Libya and migration is one that we all know that the EU worries about, and at times the EU has modelled its own engagement to help solve that crisis. And I think that itself speaks volumes about the lack of sort of strategy between the EU on the question of Libya's political future as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Comfort. As you know, we are almost out of time, and I do have one question for Olga that I'd like to get there before we wrap this first stage of today's discussion. Olga, here's the question from the audience. Your take on Ukraine is very alarming. It seems we may have no easy solution, balancing between diplomacy and controlled reaction to threats of use of force. Do you think that the response the US sent to Moscow in agreement with NATO and the EU will be effective to stop this escalation? Thanks for your thoughts, Olga.
So I haven't read the response the US sent to Moscow. It has not been released, nor has the response that NATO sent to Moscow. So I don't know what exactly is in it. I do know that the overall approach that Western states have been taking in coordination, which is on the one hand to say, look, if there's further aggression, bad things will happen, right? We will not go to war with you. We will, however, do the exact opposite of everything you're asking for in terms of a reduction in the number of forces near you. There's going to be more forces near you. We are going to take sanctions of a completely different order of magnitude than have been taken before, with costs to ourselves, but we are willing to do that in response. On the other hand, if you're willing to back down and come to the table and have conversations, we recognize that this current crisis reflects the reality that the European security architecture, which Comfort spoke about at the beginning, is not serving any of us well. It's not adequate. It was built for a different time, for different weapons, for different alignments, and we do need to have conversations about how to create a system that works for us now. And we're willing to have that conversation if you're willing to have that conversation. Will this work? I don't know. Should it work? I mean, is this the right way forward? Yes, I think this is absolutely necessary for continued peace. For instance, if you were to have a situation where it was threats alone and Moscow backed down to the threats, all you'd be doing is setting the stage for the next crisis. And certainly if you have the escalation, you're setting the stage for a whole lot of crises going forward. So I think this is the right way. To go. But they don't give you a crystal ball in graduate school. I don't know how this actually is going to play out.
Olga, nonetheless, you do make an incredibly informed case. So we're really grateful to you for your time this morning and Comfort. It's been really wonderful to have this exchange with you this morning. Giuseppe, thank you for inviting me to moderate this panel, and to the entire crisis group team in Brussels and in the field. Thank you for putting another very deeply reported piece of analysis in front of our eyes for what's set to be a tough year ahead, full of challenges. We're all going to be very busy. To our audience, thanks for joining us this Friday morning. Thank you for your questions and your attention. If you have a link to click on for the next sessions, this is the time to do so. Have a wonderful weekend, and let's hope for peace and the prevention of human suffering where it's possible. Thank you so much.